Let's talk about how to make your conclusions deeper and stronger than they were last year. To explain this, I'll be using this presentation that was developed by Cody Sigmund, who was my student teacher a couple years ago. We're thinking about writing as a series of pyramids. So this is our visual. This is the glass pyramid atop the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. Super famous. So lots of people know that there's a glass pyramid on the outside, but a lot of people don't know that there's actually La Pyramide Inversée, which is the inversed pyramid inside the museum, and then even below that, another smaller concrete pyramid. So first, if you look at the upper pyramid, think about what you notice. And what I'd like you to think about is that it's open to the light, and it draws in the light from the outside and brings it down to a focused point. Eventually we'll be talking about how this is a lot like an introduction, but for now you want to know that the very end of your introduction focuses your argument to one solid thing that you're going to argue, and that is called your thesis. Notice that the bottom pyramid mirrors the shape of the top pyramid, except in reverse. So as the top pyramid comes down to a point, the lower pyramid starts with a point and then begins to extend outward. So that upper pyramid is a lot like an introduction that funnels down to the last sentence, which contains your argument for the paper. So the thesis is the last sentence of your introduction. The thesis for this paper is going to sound a lot like this. Totalitarian dictatorships maintain control by a variety of control tactics, including propaganda, censorship, and revised history. Of these, revised history most threatens human happiness because it limits the right to knowledge and education, without which a person will never achieve his or her full potential. So I'm going to argue that as my thesis, and then I'm going to have a whole paper that happens, and I'll have evidence and analysis explaining propaganda and censorship and revised history from a variety of sources, from English and history, so the whole paper will happen. But then we're going to go into the conclusion at the end of the paper. So the question is, where should we start with the conclusion? The same way that the top pyramid comes down to a point, the lower pyramid begins with the point and then expands outward. So if you guess that we're going to start with the thesis and then work back outwards, you're right. So we're going to recap the thesis and also recap our main evidence. And for my paper, this would sound a lot like this. In both Stalinist USSR and Animal Farm, government-controlled news outlets did not report mass starvation resulting from policy failure, meaning that citizens were unable to access information that even acknowledged that they were suffering. Furthermore, through propaganda, such as artwork portraying the United States as their oppressors, North Koreans unite in hatred against the United States, which distracts them from the fact that their own government is their greatest enemy. Yet Oceania's ability to change history to suit its current political agenda shows that this control tactic is the most powerful of all. You should notice that this recap of my evidence and my thesis includes the exact same control tactics in the exact same order that I named in my thesis. It's also reminding us of the key evidence for each one of those control tactics. So we saw stuff about censorship, and then we see things about propaganda, and then we see things about revised history, which match exactly what was in my thesis. So that's what we've done with conclusions so far for our writing, is that we've recapped the thesis and we've recapped the evidence. But now I want you to pretend that what you're seeing in that conclusion so far is just the tip of the iceberg, and that there's a whole conclusion that extends beyond that. And that part of your conclusion is called your so what. Your so what should take the ideas of your paper and transition your reader back out into the world and give him or her something to take from your paper independent of what you've already argued. So think about, how are the ideas that you've examined or the evidence that you've examined, how is that relevant for your reader? Or what can you say now about the ideas in your paper that you couldn't have said in your introduction? What has somebody gained from reading your paper? Or think about how the ideas in your paper in 1984 in North Korea might be relevant to the outside world in other ways. So what other connections can you see? Your so what is what makes your paper relevant to your reader and helps your reader transition back out of your paper into the real world. So a reminder, there's 3 elements to having a strong conclusion. You want to start by recapping your thesis. then you're going to review your main evidence, and then you're going to add a really strong "so what" that helps the reader figure out what he or she should take from your paper. For this paper, if you can free write on one of these 3 questions, this will give you some ideas that you can use in your conclusion. You can also use the ideas we talked about as in the balance of the control tactics, from too extreme to not enough, and thinking about how control tactics can be held in balance, maybe in an ideal. So some questions to think about are: how does the topic of individual freedom versus group security relate to your own personal life? Or, are there times where we cannot entirely prioritize individual freedom or group security? And how do we strike a balance between the two? Or third, where do you see individual freedom and group security in conflict with each other in the real world? For example, examples from history or from current events, interactions between groups with different interests, or anything else where you can connect that idea to the real world. So again, however you get there, you've got to figure out a "so what" to help make your paper relevant beyond just the thesis and the evidence that you've argued. And that's your big new challenge for this paper.